The official story of the United States of America paints a familiar and seemingly logical picture. Across a vast continent inhabited by Native American tribes, the first European colonizers appear: the Spanish, the French, the English. Gradually, they tame the wild lands, build settlements, and lay the foundations for a future world power. Through films and novels, popular culture has created a persistent image of these pioneers. They are often portrayed as people with troubled pasts, adventurers, drunkards, and brawlers who constantly started fights in saloons and settled disputes with guns. Historical documents from the era, strangely enough, seem to confirm this unflattering image. One source describes the first colonists this way: "Many colonists were sent there, though in truth, most of them were rather questionable characters." Another passage adds to the picture. "The first colonists who settled on the James River in 1607 and founded Jamestown were adventurers, and the sort of people who had no intention of building their lives on hard work and honest labor." We are asked to believe that these very people, who lacked specialized skills and the desire to work, laid the foundation for the most advanced nation in the world. However, this established image shatters completely the moment we look at the architecture that began to appear in these lands. The same people who initially built only primitive wooden sheds somehow begin to erect the most beautiful classical buildings with majestic columns, complex facades, and perfect proportions. These structures require the highest level of engineering, mathematical calculation, and stonemasonry skill. Such masterpieces appear not only in the United States but also in places like Cuba, raising even more questions. This creates a stark contrast. On one hand, the image of rough and uneducated settlers; on the other, architectural marvels worthy of ancient civilizations. Old textbooks enthusiastically describe America's rapid technological leap. There are a great many factories and plants in the United States, especially for machine building. More railroads have been built than in all of Europe and Asia combined. The buildings in New York are astonishing in their size. It has many 20- and 30-story buildings. We are told about Chicago, which in just 100 years transformed from a small Native American village into a metropolis of 2 million, a global hub for grain and meat, with gigantic elevators and the world's largest stockyards. But behind these enthusiastic descriptions of progress, the main question is lost. How could these questionable characters, these adventurers who, as we are told, had no intention of building their lives on hard work and honest labor, achieve such an incredible leap? How did they manage to go from primitive huts to the most complex architectural and engineering projects in a single generation? If the official history isn't lying about the character of the settlers, then perhaps it is silent about the most important thing. Who was the true architect of these magnificent structures? This architectural dissonance becomes even more profound when we shift our focus from the stone facades to the steel skeletons hidden within the most ambitious structures of the era: skyscrapers. While classical buildings require skill and knowledge, skyscrapers demand something more: a colossal, highly developed industrial base that doesn't just appear out of nowhere. The official history asks us to believe that a country which only began processing metal on an industrial scale 100 to 150 years prior was the first in the world to realize such grand projects. But let's break down what is actually required to build even one skyscraper. At the core of such a building is a metal frame, assembled from massive steel beams connected by rivets. These aren't just pieces of iron. They represent the pinnacle of metallurgy for their time. To create such a structure, you need an entire production chain, where each step is a highly complex manufacturing challenge. It all starts with mining iron ore on an industrial scale. Then, the ore must be smelted into pig iron in blast furnaces, and the pig iron must then be converted into high-quality steel, a process requiring complex chemistry and temperature control. And that's only half the battle. The resulting steel had to be transformed into standardized beams of specific profiles and strengths. This required gigantic rolling mills, incredibly complex and expensive equipment. Next, millions of holes had to be drilled with high precision into these beams, which were several centimeters thick, so they would align perfectly during assembly. This in turn required powerful drilling machines and super hard drill bits. And of course, the rivets themselves had to be mass-produced by the millions. This entire process is impossible without a network of supporting factories, architectural firms, laboratories for quality control, and scientific research institutes to develop new technologies. And most importantly, all of this required thousands of highly skilled specialists: engineers, metallurgists, architects, and chemists. Official history assures us that all of this appeared in the US almost overnight, in a country that was supposedly first settled by questionable characters. Logic dictates that a technological breakthrough of this magnitude should have occurred where a centuries-old foundation for it existed. For example, in the Ural Mountains, where metal has been worked for over 5,000 years, or in the industrial centers of Europe, England, Germany, or France, where metallurgy had developed for centuries. Yet the first skyscrapers did not appear there. They rose in America, a newcomer to the industrial stage. This creates a fundamental chronological and logical paradox. It's as if a student, having just learned the alphabet, suddenly writes a brilliant novel, surpassing experienced masters. The technology and architecture seem not to have been created from scratch, but rather inherited or acquired from some unknown source. But if we set aside the physical artifacts, the buildings and machines, and look at the very essence of the nation, we encounter an even stranger and more inexplicable phenomenon. It concerns the language. As we know, people came to the US from all over Europe: the French, Spanish, Germans, Russians, and Irish. They fought together for independence from the British Empire, and after their victory, this multinational, multilingual melting pot of peoples adopted the language of yesterday's oppressor, English, as their national language. This decision contradicts all logic of national identity. How could a country that won its freedom from England on the battlefield voluntarily choose to speak the language of its main enemy? The linguistic paradox we encounter in the history of the US is perhaps even more fundamental than the mysteries of its architecture and technology. It touches the very essence of national identity, the language in which a people thinks, speaks, and writes. The official explanation, found in early 20th century textbooks, sounds deceptively simple. The English were the most numerous settlers, and so the English language became dominant. All other Europeans mixed with the English and adopted not only their language, but also their way of life and customs. But this version crumbles under the slightest scrutiny of logic and psychology. Nations that fight for their independence for centuries are, above all, fighting for their culture and language. The French, the Germans, the Spanish. These are people from nations with rich histories and pride in their heritage. To imagine that upon setting foot on new soil and shedding blood for freedom from the British Crown, they would voluntarily and en masse abandon their native tongues in favor of their recent enemy's language is to ignore human nature itself. History is full of examples where peoples, even facing total annihilation, cling to their language as the last bastion of their identity. Yet here, we are asked to believe the opposite occurred: a voluntary cultural surrender at a moment of supreme patriotic fervor. This paradox becomes even sharper when we consider the conditions where mutual understanding is a matter of life and death. The battlefield of the Revolutionary War. The colonial army was precisely that melting pot of different peoples. Picture a battle. Amidst the roar of cannons and gunpowder smoke, when every second determines the outcome, how does a commander give an order to his multilingual troops? How does a German officer command Irish and French soldiers? In what language are the commands "charge," "retreat," "fire" given? How are complex tactical maneuvers, which require perfect coordination and understanding, communicated? The idea that they communicated with hand gestures or a primitive pidgin language is simply untenable in a military context. An effective army is a single organism, and its nervous system is a set of clear commands understood by all. The existence of such an army implies that a common language was already in place before the conflict even began. If we add another fact to this linguistic puzzle, the picture becomes deeply troubling. Look at an administrative map of the United States. The borders between states, especially in the West and Midwest, are unnatural straight lines, drawn as if with a ruler. These straight lines cut across deserts, mountains, and plains, ignoring natural landscapes, rivers, or ethnic territories. They don't suggest a natural historical process, but an artificial division. They are strikingly similar to how European colonizers divided Africa in the 19th century, carving up the map into spheres of influence without any regard for the local populations. Even the term president, which seems to be a uniquely American invention, is defined in pre-revolutionary Russian dictionaries as an official title for an administration, for example in the English colonies in India. Artificial borders, a strange linguistic history, inexplicable technological leaps. All of this suggests that the official story of the creation of the United States may not just be incomplete, but deliberately distorted. What if we are not witnessing the birth of a new country from scratch, but something entirely different? A forceful takeover and a complete reshaping of a civilization that already existed on this territory. In such a paradigm, many events take on a completely different meaning. And the key act of this reshaping, the point of no return after which the old history was erased and a new one was written, might not have been the Revolutionary War, but the conflict we call the Civil War. The American Civil War of 1861 to 1865 is presented as a tragic but noble chapter in history. A battle between the progressive industrial North and the slave-owning agrarian South. The official cause of the conflict, the abolition of slavery, has become a cornerstone of the national myth, a symbol of the victory of humanism and equality. However, upon closer inspection, this noble facade begins to crack at the seams, revealing oddities and contradictions that cast doubt on the very nature of the conflict. The pretext for the war itself raises questions. Slavery was undoubtedly a horrific institution, but was its abolition the true goal? Facts that lie outside the scope of school textbooks paint a different picture. After the war ended and slavery was formally abolished, so-called human zoos continued to exist in the United States and even in enlightened Europe. In these shameful exhibitions, people of other races, including African Americans, were put on display in enclosures like exotic animals. This fact clashes violently with the image of a humane society that had just shed the blood of hundreds of thousands of its citizens in the name of liberating the oppressed. It calls into question the sincerity of the Northern liberators and suggests that the fight against slavery was merely a convenient smokescreen, an ideological cover for entirely different, more pragmatic goals. But the greatest mystery of the Civil War is not its cause, but its beginning. If it was truly an internal conflict, a nation splitting into two warring factions, one would logically expect the first battles to occur somewhere in the country's interior. on disputed territory along the border between North and South. But history tells us otherwise. The war does not begin on land, but from the sea. The first act is the attack and destruction of Fort Sumter, which guarded the strategically vital port city of Charleston from the sea. Such a scenario, an attack from the sea on a key port, is highly uncharacteristic of a civil war. But it is the classic, textbook strategy of colonial conquest. This is precisely how all colonial empires operated for centuries. For example, in the conquest of India. First, a port city was captured to serve as a beachhead and supply base. Then, the entire coastline was brought under control, cutting the country off from the outside world. Only after that did a methodical advance into the interior begin, subjugating the entire territory. The beginning of the American Civil War follows this pattern with frightening accuracy. It looks less like an internal conflict and more like an external intervention, an invasion to conquer an entire nation. After the destruction of Fort Sumter, Charleston itself was devastated, officially by a fire. But what happened to the fort demands separate consideration. We are told that this powerful fortress, with walls several meters thick, was destroyed by artillery bombardment. It was shelled by cannons firing balls filled with simple black powder. However, the ruins of Fort Sumter tell a completely different story. They show a degree of destruction utterly inconsistent with the capabilities of mid-19th century artillery. Even modern NATO shells packed with powerful explosives cannot always inflict such damage on ancient stone fortifications. The walls of the Brest Fortress, which were hit by 1.5 and 2-ton aerial bombs, bear the scars of immense destruction. But even they were not obliterated in the way Fort Sumter was. The official version of powder-filled cannonballs seems simply absurd when compared to what the fortress became. These ruins testify to the use of a weapon of incredible, monstrous destructive power, orders of magnitude greater than anything in the arsenals of the time. Looking at these remains, one cannot help but ask, what kind of force was unleashed in Charleston Harbor, and what weapon could have left such a mark? The discrepancy between the power of 19th century artillery and the scale of destruction at Fort Sumter is merely a prologue to a much more disturbing story. What happened to the fortress was not an isolated incident. It was just the first flash of a firestorm that would later sweep through the cities of the American South, leaving behind ruins that cannot be explained by the official narrative. After the fall of the fort, the city of Charleston was virtually destroyed. Then came the turn of Richmond, Virginia, the capital of the Confederacy. Officially, the city burned down in 1865. But the word burned is a deceptively mild term for the apocalypse that was unleashed there. City maps from that era exist, on which entire downtown blocks are marked in black as completely annihilated. But even these diagrams fail to convey the full horror. When we look at the aftermath of a typical city fire, even a massive one, we see a specific pattern. For example, in the burned-out city of Minsk from World War II, the shells of buildings remained standing. Wooden floors and roofs were gone, and internal walls had collapsed, but the main stone and brick structures largely survived. They are skeletons of buildings that could be rebuilt. In Richmond, however, we see something entirely different. Here, the shells themselves were obliterated. Of massive, multi-story stone buildings, only small fragments of walls remain, jutting out from a sea of pulverized brick and rubble. Entire streets were turned to dust. This is not the result of a fire where only flammable materials burn. This is the result of a colossal energy that pulverized stone and brick. The destruction was not limited to residential and administrative buildings. The railroad bridge connecting Richmond to the city of Petersburg was completely destroyed. All that remained were its stone piers, and the condition of these piers speaks volumes. The white stone they were built from had begun to crumble and flake, a direct result of exposure to a monstrous temperature, far exceeding that of a normal fire. Of the metal bridge deck and railway tracks, not a trace was left. It was as if they had vaporized. And the city of Petersburg itself, where this railway led, also appears in old photographs as the same kind of horrific ruins. To understand the abnormality of this destruction, we must compare it to the aftermath of 20th century wars, where far more powerful weapons were used. We have seen footage of an old fort in Yugoslavia shelled by modern NATO projectiles. Yes, there is damage, but the walls are generally intact. We have seen the ruins of Stalingrad and Dresden, wiped from the face of the earth by carpet bombing. The destruction there was monstrous. But even in that hell, the skeletons of buildings and large structural fragments remained. What we see in Richmond and Charleston is qualitatively different. It is total annihilation, the transformation of matter into dust, which is characteristic not so much of a blast wave, but of an extremely powerful light and thermal radiation. The destruction of this scale and nature forces us to seek another explanation. One that goes beyond conventional 19th century warfare. The official story of a fire from a knocked-over kerosene lamp or a bombardment from primitive cannons looks like a clumsy attempt to hide the truth. The evidence of the ruins, the complete obliteration of stone buildings, their pulverization into rubble, the melting and vaporization of metal structures, the flaking of stone from extreme heat, all of this is frighteningly reminiscent of the effects of a tactical nuclear weapon. It is the only explanation that logically connects all the observed anomalies. But if that is the case, we are not talking about a civil war, but about the methodical destruction of cities using a weapon of mass destruction. It was an act of total cleansing, and if a highly developed civilization truly existed on U.S. territory, and was annihilated in such a barbaric way, with its cities physically erased, the next question arises. Would any hint of its existence have survived in the documents, books, and chronicles of the time? If the physical destruction of the cities was carried out so ruthlessly and methodically, it is logical to assume that the historical record was wiped just as thoroughly. The victors write history. That is an axiom. Any direct mention of a preceding civilization, its government, technology, and culture would have been removed and destroyed. However, it is impossible to erase memory completely. The truth, like water, always finds a crack to seep through, appearing in the most unexpected places. We should not look for it in the official chronicles written by the victors, but in passing remarks, in circumstantial evidence, in the works of contemporaries who perhaps did not fully understand what they were describing. One such unexpected source is the work of Jules Verne, a writer known not only for his imagination, but also for his astonishing attention to detail. His novels are not just fiction. They are meticulous snapshots of the era, based on the most advanced knowledge of his time. In his famous novel Around the World in 80 Days, while describing Phileas Fogg's journey across the United States, Verne makes a fleeting but stunning observation. As the locomotive speeds the heroes through Indiana, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, the author writes, passing cities with classical names, many of which had streets and even horse-drawn railways, but as yet no houses. Let us reflect on this sentence. This is not a description of settling a wild frontier. Pioneers do not start by laying out streets and tracks in the middle of an empty field. They build houses which then form streets. Infrastructure, roads, transport, comes later as the settlement grows. Jules Verne describes the complete opposite, an entirely illogical process. He is describing ruins. He is describing a landscape after a catastrophe. Cities with classical names is a reference to the same majestic architecture we discussed earlier. Had streets and horse-drawn railways describes the skeleton of a city, its layout and transport network that remained after the buildings themselves were destroyed. But as yet, no houses is a direct indication that the city is empty, its residential and commercial buildings wiped from the face of the earth. And the horse-drawn railway is a detail that reveals decay. The tracks, intended for steam locomotives or streetcars, remain, but the technology itself is gone, and so wagons are pulled by a primitive power source: horses. In fact, Jules Verne, perhaps without realizing it, documented the very state of the cities we see in the photographs of Richmond and Charleston. If fiction seems like unconvincing evidence, let's turn to a more serious source. A textbook titled History of Mankind, World History, published in St. Petersburg in 1903. In its description of the early colonization of North America, we find equally strange passages. When discussing the first French settlers, the author writes that they founded small settlements near Quebec. Notice the phrasing, near Quebec. This implies that Quebec already exists on the map as a known landmark, a pre-existing city next to which the newcomers are settling. They are not founding Quebec, they are settling near it. Even more revealing is another passage from the same textbook. They therefore moved back through Illinois and Des Plaines in the direction of Chicago. Again, the same pattern. Chicago is mentioned as the destination, an existing geographical location. One might argue that it refers to a small Native American village of that name. But this very textbook states a few pages later that French missionaries are only just beginning their work, and one of their goals is to accustom the Indians to a settled life, which directly harms the fur trade. So according to the textbook itself, permanent, settled Native American villages were only just beginning to appear at that time. How then could a major landmark named Chicago have existed, serving as the destination for an expedition? The pieces of the puzzle begin to form a coherent picture. On one hand, we have inexplicable architecture and technology. On another, a linguistic paradox and artificial borders. On a third, a civil war that looks more like an intervention with weapons of terrifying power. And finally, in the texts of the era, we find ghostly traces, passing remarks that describe cities with no houses and pre-existing metropolises where, according to the official version, there should have been only wild prairies. All of this leads us to the final, ultimate question. If this advanced civilization truly existed, if it was conquered and destroyed and its history rewritten, then what kind of state existed before the United States? Whose classical cities were turned to ruins, and whose legacy was appropriated and passed off as its own incredible achievement? When the individual pieces of the puzzle fall into place, the official version of history begins to look not just incomplete, but utterly implausible. The inconsistencies cease to be random anomalies and instead form a coherent, frightening system of evidence. The image of uneducated settlers erecting classical palaces, the appearance of skyscrapers in a country with no centuries-old metallurgical tradition, a multinational army fighting against the English and then voluntarily adopting their language, the artificial, ruler-drawn borders of the states. And finally, the so-called Civil War, which begins like a colonial intervention and ends with cities being turned to dust by a weapon of unseen power. This cannot be a series of coincidences. These are all symptoms of a single, global falsification, the traces of a grand catastrophe that was deliberately erased from human memory. From these fragments of facts and contradictions, a picture of an alternative reality emerges. It suggests that on the territory of North America, before the modern United States, a highly advanced civilization existed and thrived. Whether it was part of a global classical culture, whose traces we find all over the planet, or an independent state, is an open question. But the evidence indicates that it possessed profound knowledge of architecture, construction, metallurgy, and perhaps technologies that we are only now beginning to rediscover. The cities that the first colonists described as pre-existing landmarks, Quebec, Chicago, were its legacy. The majestic buildings with columns which cannot be attributed to the first settlers were its creation. The developed infrastructure, including railway networks, the remnants of which Jules Verne witnessed, was its achievement. In this context, the events of the 19th century appear in a completely different light. What is presented to us as an era of settlement and civil war was, in fact, a period of conquest and destruction of this civilization. The War of 1861 to 1865 was not an internal conflict, but the culmination of this conquest, the final act in a violent cleansing of the territory. The key cities, which were the cultural, administrative, and industrial centers of the Old World, were methodically wiped from the face of the earth with weapons of colossal power. After the physical foundation of the civilization was turned to ruins, the second phase began, the erasure of information. History was rewritten. Heroes and events were fabricated, and the true timeline of events was hidden behind the myth of a wild frontier and brave pioneers. The modern United States was not built on empty land, but literally on the bones and foundations of its predecessor, appropriating its legacy and passing it off as its own miracle of progress. We have presented only some of the facts and constructed a possible version of events from them. This version may seem shocking, but unlike the official one, it logically explains the many anomalies that mainstream history prefers to ignore. However, the truth does not vanish without a trace. It has been preserved in the ruins they could not hide, in the old books they did not have time to edit, in the antique photographs stored in the archives of the Library of Congress. It awaits a careful researcher, one who is willing to cast aside imposed stereotypes and look at the past with an open mind. Study old maps. Compare photographs of cities before and after the official fires and earthquakes. Read the primary sources instead of their later interpretations. Perhaps then, a completely different picture will unfold before you. What if all the history we know is merely the newest, uppermost layer, beneath which lies another, far older, more vast, and more tragic reality?